It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind where the world seemed to move slower. Sunlight spilled softly across the kitchen table, catching on the rim of the coffee cup in my daughter's hands. She sat across from me, shoulders drawn in slightly, avoiding my eyes. Her fingers kept tracing the edge of the cup as if searching for the right words hidden somewhere in the ceramic. When they finally came, they weren't sharp. They weren't shouted, but they landed heavier than any scream could have. "You're not the parent I wanted." For a moment, I didn't breathe. The words hung in the air, too strange to be real, too heavy to ignore. My mind reached for something to say, but instead, it scattered, chasing memories, holding her tiny hand on her first day of school, rushing to the hospital when she fell off her bike, staying up all night with a wet towel on her forehead when fever refused to break. I remembered birthdays spent planning her smile, and nights spent working overtime so her Christmas mornings would be full. I searched her face, looking for some hint of hesitation, some flicker that might mean she didn't mean it. But her expression stayed calm, distant. She wasn't angry. She was certain. "I feel misunderstood," she continued, her voice steady. "Like you've always held me back. Like I couldn't be who I wanted with you around." I felt the weight of each word press against me, slow and deliberate. I thought of the thousands of times I'd told her she could be anything, how I had bitten back my own dreams to make space for hers. I wanted to tell her that. I wanted to defend myself, to argue that love sometimes looks like caution, that holding back was another way of saying I don't want you to get hurt. Instead, I nodded slowly, my face softened into something I hoped would look like understanding. Inside, it felt like my heart was folding in on itself, crumpling under the truth she believed about me. I forced a small smile, not because I felt like smiling, but because I didn't want her to see me break. My voice was barely above a whisper when I finally spoke. "But I'm still here." The days blurred together, each one quieter than the last. Our conversations, once easy, unplanned, and full of small stories, became fewer, then almost non-existent. If we spoke at all, it was about practical things, the time of an appointment, a package arriving, a bill to be paid. There was no warmth in these exchanges, just the bare bones of communication. I noticed the change in subtle ways at first. She no longer told me about her day. She no longer lingered at the table after meals. And then, it became undeniable. Family gatherings came and went without my name on the guest list. I would hear about them afterward through photographs online, my absence tucked neatly out of frame. When I did attend events, those I stumbled into or could not be excluded from, she stood surrounded by her friends, laughing, her face lit in a way I hadn't seen in years. But when her gaze landed on me, the light dimmed. She would offer a polite smile before turning back to the conversation. There were no introductions, no acknowledgement beyond the bare minimum. I was simply there. The moments that cut deepest were often the smallest. One afternoon, I found the living room shelf rearranged. The framed photographs, my arms around her as a child, her gap-toothed grin, the two of us at the beach, were gone. In their place stood generic prints from department stores, images of strangers smiling in a way that felt painfully deliberate. On another occasion, I overheard her telling a colleague on the phone that she lived alone, despite the fact that my footsteps echoed through the same hallway every day. Yet even as the distance between us grew, I could not bring myself to step away completely. I stayed on the edges, silent but steady. When the power bill came overdue, I paid it without mentioning it. When her kitchen sink began to leak, I fixed it before she returned from work. When she had a major presentation, I quietly left a small note of encouragement near her coffee mug, unsigned, as if it had appeared out of thin air. I attended her milestones without being asked, sat in the farthest seat at the back, clapping softly, leaving before anyone could see me. I told myself I was respecting her space, but the truth was simpler. I was holding on to the only way I knew to love her, without demanding to be loved in return. There was a dignity in my silence, but it came at a cost. Each passing week carved a little more out of me, leaving an ache that no amount of quiet presence could heal. Still, I stayed. I was unwilling, perhaps unable, to walk away. I can still remember the day it became just the two of us. The door closed behind the other parent, and the silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. She was so young then, clinging to my leg, not yet understanding that our world had just shifted forever. I promised her that day, quietly, to myself, that no matter how hard it got, she would never feel alone. Those early years were a balancing act I was never trained for. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, catching my breath between shifts, finding creative ways to stretch every dollar. My dreams, college courses I wanted to take, trips I had once imagined, were quietly folded up and placed on a shelf, traded for the steady, constant work of building a life where she could feel safe. There were nights I came home so tired my bones ached, but she would greet me at the door with a story to tell or a picture she had drawn. I'd kneel down, listen as if nothing else in the world mattered, because in those moments, nothing did. I still remember the look on her face the day I surprised her with her first bicycle. I had saved for months, skipping lunches at work, mending my shoes instead of replacing them. The joy in her eyes as she touched the handlebars for the first time made every sacrifice feel invisible, as if I hadn't given anything up at all. When school projects rolled around, I was there, spreading construction paper, markers, and glue across the table, fighting sleep just to help her get it perfect. We'd work late into the night, side by side, her little head sometimes nodding off against my arm as I kept going for both of us. At her high school graduation, I was the loudest voice in the crowd. I can still hear my own cheer echoing in my ears, see her scanning the stands until she found me. She waved, grinning, holding her diploma high like it was ours to share. In a way, it was. Back then, our bond felt unshakable. We were a team. She knew I was her biggest cheerleader, her safe place, her constant. And I knew, deep in my bones, that every hour, every sacrifice, every quiet choice to put her first was worth it. But now, when I sit across from her and see the guarded distance in her eyes, I wonder where the thread began to fray. I wonder when my presence stopped feeling like home and started feeling like something she needed to escape. I think back to the laughter we once shared, the way she used to reach for my hand without hesitation, the way she once believed I could fix anything. Somewhere between then and now, love stopped being enough. And I can't help but ask myself the question that keeps me awake at night. When did that happen? It happened on an evening that should have been light-hearted. She had invited a small group over, friends from work, a couple of neighbors. I wasn't really part of the plan, just passing through the living room on my way to the kitchen when someone brought up a topic I actually knew something about. I offered a comment, casual and friendly, thinking I was adding to the conversation. She laughed, short, sharp, not the kind that warms a room. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her eyes sweeping over me with a smile that wasn't kind. "You've never been successful." The room shifted instantly. A few people laughed, but it was the uneasy kind, the kind that stumbles out when no one knows what else to do. One man coughed into his drink. Another woman glanced away, pretending to check her phone. My cheeks burned, though I forced my face into a polite, unshaken smile. I gave a small chuckle, as if her words had been a harmless joke. Inside, something in me folded in on itself. It wasn't the first time she diminished me, but it was the first time she'd done it so openly, so easily, without even realizing, or caring, what it cost. I excused myself quietly, muttering something about needing to check the oven, though I hadn't been cooking anything at all. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, letting the laughter from the living room blur into a low hum behind me. The hurt settled deep, a familiar weight pressing against my ribs. I thought of the years I had worked until my hands ached, the dreams I had put on hold, the nights I had chosen her needs over my own. And still, in her eyes, I had somehow never crossed the threshold into successful. I didn't feel anger, at least, not the kind that demands revenge. What I felt was something quieter, heavier, a longing. I wanted her to see me, not as the parent she wished I'd been, but as the one who had stayed. I wanted her to understand that my success had never been in titles or bank accounts. It had been in her, That night, as I listened to the muffled sound of her laughter with others, I made a decision. I wouldn't try to prove myself to her anymore. I wouldn't insert myself where I wasn't wanted, wouldn't offer my opinion unless it was asked for. If she believed I had held her back, then I would step aside completely. Let her live without the weight of my presence. I'd still be here, of course, always. But from that moment on, I would live in the quiet edges of her life, where my love could not be mistaken for interference. Distance became my way of protecting us both. I no longer tried to sit beside her in a room full of her friends, no longer offered advice she didn't want, no longer reached for conversations she kept at arm's length. But stepping back didn't mean turning away. I found other ways, quiet ways, to still be part of her life. When the electricity bill turned red with an overdue stamp, I paid it online before the power company could send another warning. She never knew. The confirmation email came to me, not her. Days later, I heard her on the phone telling someone how lucky she was that the payment must have gone through after all. When her pantry shelves looked sparse, I arranged for grocery deliveries. The labels read gift from a neighbor, though no neighbor had been involved. I picked items I knew she liked, brands she'd been buying since she was little. The delivery drivers never mentioned my name. I made sure of that. On weeks when I could see the strain in her shoulders, the tension in her face, I slipped small envelopes into her mailbox. $50, sometimes $100, just enough to breathe a little easier. I never wrote a note, never signed my name. She accepted these small mercies without question, never tracing them back to me. And I told myself that was good. That was how I wanted it. There was a certain bittersweet satisfaction in knowing I was still her safety net, even if she didn't realize it. I could keep her afloat without interfering in the life she had so clearly carved out to exist without me. I could still be a parent in the way I knew best, by showing up, even when I wasn't invited. Yet sometimes, late at night, the question would come. Would it matter if she knew? Would it change anything? Or would the knowledge only make her pull further away? I imagined telling her, watching her eyes widen as the pieces clicked together. The bills that vanished from her worry, the groceries that appeared when she needed them most, the money that arrived like clockwork when she was falling short. I wondered if she would see it as love or as pity. In the end, I decided not to risk it. Some truths, I told myself, are less about being shared and more about being lived. My love didn't need her recognition to be real. It had always been enough for me to know she was safe, fed, and cared for, even if I was just a shadow in the background. Still, there were moments, watching her from afar, seeing her smile without knowing I had played a part, when my chest ached. Not with regret, but with a quiet longing of someone who has learned to love without being seen. And maybe that was the purest kind of love there was. Or maybe it was just the loneliest. I wasn't sure anymore. It started as whispers from people who knew people. A friend of a friend mentioned she'd been out of work for weeks. Someone else hinted that her partner had moved out, taking more than just his belongings. Then came the murmurs about money, loans she'd taken, credit cards she couldn't pay. She never said a word to me. Not a call, not a text. If she was struggling, she was determined to carry it alone, or at least, without me knowing. I wouldn't have found out the truth if it weren't for a mutual acquaintance who let it slip over coffee. They didn't even realize I hadn't known. Their voice was casual, almost offhand, but every detail landed like a stone in my chest. The next afternoon, I spotted her through the window of a small cafe, the kind of place she used to love when life felt lighter. She sat in a corner booth, a half-empty cup of tea in front of her, papers spread across the table. I moved closer to the glass without meaning to, and that's when I saw them. Unpaid bills, final notices stamped in red, a bank statement with numbers that spoke of desperation. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look sad. She just looked tired, as if the fight had gone out of her, replaced by a numbness that made her stare at the same page for minutes without moving. I stood there longer than I should have, debating. The memory of her words, "You're not the parent I wanted," still echoed in the back of my mind. Every part of me wanted to protect the little pride I had left, to walk away and let her handle her life as she'd insisted she could. But love is a way of ignoring dignity. That night, I sent another anonymous grocery delivery. The next day, I paid off one of her utility bills before it could be shut off. I thought maybe that would be enough to give her a little air, a little room to breathe. It wasn't. A week later, I saw her again, this time outside the bank, shoulders hunched, eyes red, her hands shaking as she folded a piece of paper into her purse. She crossed the street and stopped halfway down the block, leaning against a wall as if she didn't have the strength to stand on her own. That was my breaking point. I walked toward her, my steps careful, measured. When she looked up, surprise flickered across her face, quickly followed by something else. Shame, maybe, or fear. "You don't have to," she started, but her voice caught. I stopped in front of her, close enough to see the cracks she'd been trying to hide. My words were quiet, steady, carrying none of the judgment she might have expected. "I'm still here," I said. Her eyes filled instantly, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The traffic hummed around us. People passed by without a glance. But in that small stretch of sidewalk, time felt still. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. We sat in her small apartment, the blinds half closed, letting in slivers of late afternoon light. The air was heavy with everything unsaid, and for a while neither of us moved. She sat across from me, hands knotted together in her lap, eyes fixed on the carpet as though the word she needed might be hidden there. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "I need to tell you something," she began, still not looking at me. "All those years, it wasn't that you weren't enough. It was me. I felt wrong, inadequate, like I could never match what you gave me. Every time I saw how much you sacrificed, it made me feel small, like I could never repay it." I let the words settle. They weren't easy for her to say, and they weren't easy to hear, not because they hurt, but because I could feel the weight she'd been carrying all this time. She swallowed hard and continued. "I thought if I pushed you away, I could prove to myself that I could stand on my own, that I didn't need to lean on you. But it just made me feel more lost, like cutting off the only anchor I had." Her voice broke then, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as if to keep the rest from spilling out too quickly. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees. "I never needed you to be perfect," I said softly. "I never needed payback. I just wanted the chance to love you, without you thinking it came with conditions. That was all I ever wanted." Her eyes flicked up to mine then, red and wet. "I know. I think I always knew. But it was easier to tell myself you were the problem than admit I was scared. Scared I'd disappoint you. Scared I'd never be enough after everything you gave up for me." I shook my head slowly. "You were enough the day you were born. Nothing you could do would change that." She gave a small, broken laugh and wiped at her eyes. "You make it sound so simple." "Love is simple," I replied. "It's people who make it complicated." The room fell into silence after that. Not the brittle, tense silence we'd shared so often in recent years, but something warmer, softer. It was the kind of silence that lets you breathe, the kind that feels like space rather than distance. I could see she was still holding back, still afraid that one conversation couldn't mend years of hurt. And she was right, it couldn't. But it could be a start. She reached for her mug, hands still trembling, and I noticed the smallest shift in her posture. She was leaning toward me now, not away. We didn't hug. We didn't say we forgave each other. But when she poured me a second cup of coffee without asking, and I accepted it with a quiet thank you, it felt like something had been restored. Not everything, but enough. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was real. And for the first time in years, real felt like more than enough. Months passed, and life settled into a quieter rhythm. We spoke more often now. Not every day, not without awkward pauses, but enough that the silences no longer felt like walls. I wasn't expecting anything grand to come from it. I had made peace with being present without the need for recognition. So when she called one morning, her voice a little brighter than usual, and said, "I'd like you to come to something," I didn't think much of it. She mentioned it was a work event, some kind of ceremony, but she didn't say more. I agreed without hesitation. The evening of the event, I arrived at a modest hall filled with rows of chairs and warm light spilling from the stage. People milled about in clusters, chatting over glasses of water and tea. I found a seat near the back, content to watch. The program began with speeches from her colleagues. She sat on stage, poised and confident, wearing a smile I hadn't seen since she was young. I felt a small tug in my chest, the kind that comes from pride you're trying to keep to yourself. Then, toward the end, the host announced that there would be a special recognition for a person whose quiet support had made all the difference. I assumed it would be one of her mentors from work, someone who had guided her professionally. But then she stood, holding the microphone, scanning the audience until her eyes landed on me. "I want to thank someone who has been my constant," she began, her voice carrying across the hall. "Someone who stayed, even when I made it hard, even when I pushed them away. This is my parent, the one who stayed anyway." The room turned toward me, but I barely noticed. My heart was too full, my throat too tight. I walked to the stage slowly, not because I hesitated, but because I wanted to remember each step. She handed me a small plaque, but the real gift was the look in her eyes, clear, open, and steady. There was applause, polite and warm, but I didn't need it. The moment itself was enough. Standing beside her, hearing her speak those words, was more than I had ever hoped for. Later that night, we returned to her apartment. The kitchen table was the same one from the day everything changed, the day she told me I wasn't the parent she wanted. But this time, the air was different. We sat across from each other, coffee cups in hand. She told me stories from work. I teased her about her new haircut, and she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and light. It felt like something that had been broken was now patched together, not perfectly, but strong enough to hold. I looked at her, memorizing the way the lamplight touched her face, and thought of how far we had come. She once said I wasn't the parent she wanted, but I became the one she'll never forget. People often talk about the joy of being wanted. They imagine it as the highest form of love, to be chosen, to be celebrated, to be welcomed with open arms. And yes, being wanted is a beautiful thing. But life has taught me something quieter, something harder. There's a difference between being wanted and being needed. Being wanted feels good, but it can be fleeting. It depends on moods, on circumstances, on the way someone sees you in that moment. Being needed, that runs deeper. It's not always glamorous. Sometimes it's thankless. Sometimes it means standing outside the circle, holding steady so that when the world tilts, you're still there to catch the fall. I wasn't always wanted by my daughter. In fact, for a long time, I was very clearly not wanted at all. She pushed me away, told me in plain words that I wasn't the parent she wished for. And still, I stayed, not because I didn't have the pride to leave, but because love, the real kind, doesn't keep score. Love doesn't wait for applause before it shows up. It doesn't need an audience to keep going. Love's truest strength is its ability to remain, even when it's uninvited. There were days when my presence was a shadow she didn't want crossing her doorway, and nights when my help had to arrive without a name attached. But through all of it, I held on to one truth. She didn't have to want me for me to be her parent. That role wasn't given to me by her approval. It was carved into me by every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every quiet choice to put her first. Now, when she calls me, when we share coffee without the weight of all that silence between us, I know we've found something stronger than the desire to be wanted. We found trust again. And if there's one thing I'd tell anyone listening, it's this: being wanted feels wonderful. But being the one who stays, even when you're not, that's where love proves what it's really made of.